I'm Francis Durnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today we assess the evolving military situation on the ground, examine the news that Putin has sacked his deputy defence minister, reflect on the apparent assassination of a pro-Russian collaborator in occupied Melitopol, and consider the latest developments following Zelensky's call with President Xi.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
We need a military strategy for Ukraine to gain a decisive advantage on the battlefield, to win the war.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 27th of April, 1 year and 62 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and our guest, Peter Dickinson from the Atlantic Council, a leading US-based think tank on international affairs. We reflect on the sort of security guarantees Ukraine will need to provide stability to the country after the war. But first, I asked Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hi, Francis. Hello, everybody. So last night there was a missile strike in Mykolaiv. So Mykolaiv is about 30 k's northwest of Kherson. It's on the route round the corner to Odessa. There was an apartment block hit there early hours of this morning, killed one, at least one, injured 23, including a child. President Zelensky has said that it was launched from the Black Sea, 4 Caliber cruise missiles launched from the Black Sea into Mykolaiv. That's ongoing at the moment with the clear-up operation there, so the injured and dead may rise. Secondly, an interesting story, you might see this around social media, but a Russian colonel's been arrested for stealing 7 T-90 tank engines worth 20 million rubles, about $250,000 US dollars. This is coming from Russian newspaper Kommersant, reported by Chris O_wiki on Twitter, independent military history author and researcher. We've referred to a lot of his tweets before, and they are good. So this was a story about Colonel Alexander Denisov, who's the head of the Armoured Vehicle Service in the Southern Military District's Technical Support Department. He's been accused of large-scale fraud between November 21 and April 22 as part of an organised criminal group, accused of stealing 7 of the V-92C2 engines that were destined for T-90s. They're built in the Chelyabinsk tractor plant, used exclusively on T-90s and the later variants of the T-72, the B-3 variants. We don't know who he was working with or buying the engines for, but Kommersant say that this is not the first time it's happened, and they refer to 3 colonels in a similar armoured vehicle servicing unit in 2019 convicted of stealing and selling truck engines, the Kamaz truck engines, so not tanks but other trucks, the big I think they're 6x6 something. Anyway, as one of the replies in the Twitter thread stream said, this would be a great way. I mean, so that's interesting enough as it is, and I think speaks of the corruption throughout the Russian system that we've long been reporting and is evident. But as the reply said, great way for somebody to sabotage Russia, the West maybe, put in a long-term covert operation to try and buy these things and then let the corrupt officials just go and do their own thing. No suggestion that's happening here, but I think that would be a very modern twist on partisan activity, for example. Related to that is the news this morning that Russian General Mikhail Mizintsev has been removed as the Deputy Defence Minister of Russia. This is from Russian media, with suggestions again of corruption throughout the logistic chain. So Mizintsev was branded by Ukrainian media as the Butcher of Mariupol because of suggestions that he was in charge of Russian forces when a maternity hospital, another children's hospital, the drama theatre and civilian areas in Mariupol were hit during the war. That's debated whether or not he was just in an administrative role at the time of those strikes. Regardless, he's been sacked. He's under international sanctions from the EU, UK and others. And although there's been no official information about the dismissal, it does seem very credible from the sources. Elsewhere, where are we now? Let's go to Melitopol. So this is in the Russian-held area of Ukraine, towards the coast, over by Mariupol, over that way in the south. A pro-Russian collaborator was killed in an explosion in the city. The Ukrainian press is saying Alexander Mischenko, who 42 years old, before the full-scale invasion, was the head of the Prizovsky police department, was killed, and another injured. So Ivan Fedorov, who's the exiled Ukrainian mayor of Melitopol, said it was quite powerful. We are aware that it targeted a collaborator who had been working with local law enforcement. And the reports from Ukrainian media are that this follows, it sounds quite chaotic, but follows a reported gun skirmish in the city around 4 a.m. and another explosion elsewhere about an hour later, but no further details known on any of those. There's video on our website at the moment, Twitter video from Special Hairs on Cat. Thank you, Special Hairs on Cat, which, again, we can't verify when and where it was taken, but cross-checking some of the comments and other geographical information, it does seem to be from the area from this morning. But that suggests the seat of the explosion was not a car bomb, although you'll see in the imagery, you'll see in the film, there are many vehicles, many cars damaged in the area and destroyed in the area. But it looks like the seat of the explosion was off the road, in the, if you can imagine, the grass strip running between the footpath and the road itself. So if something's dug in there, I just looked at that and I thought, well, that suggests a bit more planning, to go in there and actually dig something in rather than drive a car bomb into position, although probably less technically sophisticated if you've dug it in rather than a car bomb, but seems very, very obviously specifically targeted against this guy. And Melitopol has for months been the seat of really high-level partisan activity. We've reported on it many, many times. And just one to finish off with it, I don't think it's that significant, but just because you'll see it around the bazaars. Tuesday morning, it's reported late last night, but Tuesday morning, British and German fighter jets intercepted 3 Russian planes over the Baltic Sea. There were 2 Su-27 fighters that seemed to be escorting one IL-20, Ilyushin-20 reconnaissance plane. Now, they're in international airspace, that's fine, but the cheeky tinkers had their transponders off, which you shouldn't really be doing, and RAF and German Typhoon fighters were scrambled from the Amari Air Base in Estonia. Now, this is, as I say, this is fairly standard stuff. This is all part of NATO's Baltic Air Policing mission. That's a rotating air mission around the Allies. It's those duties currently being discharged by the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. And then from next month, it's the RAF only until the next turn of the wheel. And so nothing happened, and the vast majority of these intercepts happen. They're going on in air and sea all around NATO's edges. It happens a lot off the north coast of Scotland, that we get a bear coming down and the RAF have to go up and just keep an eye on it. Happens all the time. Largely benign, but of course there have been incidents over the Black Sea in particular, so not the Baltic that we're discussing today, but last year you did have that incident over the Black Sea with the RAF RC-135 Rivet Joint electronic surveillance aircraft that had a missile fired. MOD at the time said in the vicinity of those recent leaks from Washington, the sort of high-level intelligence leaks were suggesting it was more than in the vicinity of, and it was much more serious, but we may never know. But what I'm saying is that these incidents of reaching out and touching the other side aren't always quite as benign as this incident on Tuesday suggests it may be. I'll take a pause there.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Before we turn to Peter Dickinson of the Atlantic Council, there are a few diplomatic updates I wanted to pass on to listeners. Now, at the time of our broadcast yesterday, we heard the breaking news that Zelensky and President Xi of China had finally had their first phone call. We now have the Ukrainian readout from that conversation, among with certain other developments that have happened afterwards. And so I'll summarise that now. So we understand that during a productive hour-long conversation, the heads of state discussed a full range of topical issues of bilateral relations. That's according to the Ukrainians. Special attention was paid to the ways of possible cooperation to establish a just and sustainable peace for Ukraine. China said it would send an envoy to Ukraine to broker a political settlement, that's their phrase, to the war. President Zelensky expressed gratitude to the Chinese side for the humanitarian assistance that they've received and noted that Ukraine properly cares about the safety of Chinese citizens in the country. The parties discuss ways to strengthen the Ukrainian-Chinese partnership. And I'll read a quote from the pullout. Before the full-scale invasion, China was Ukraine's number one trading partner. I believe that our conversation today will give a powerful impetus to the return, preservation and development of this dynamic at all levels. That's what President Zelensky said in the call. This should be facilitated by the resumption of the work of the Bilateral Intergovernmental Commission and the appointment of the ambassador of Ukraine to China. It goes on, the parties emphasise the importance of efforts to establish peace. But perhaps the most interesting line in all of this, which is leading to some raised eyebrows this morning, is Zelensky reaffirming Ukraine's unwavering position to adherence to the One China policy and thanked the president of the People's Republic of China for China's support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity. So, why is this significant? Well, the One China policy, and this is coming straight out from Sophia Yan, of course, familiar to listeners, our China correspondent. She says the One China policy defines Taiwan as part of China. This one line so high up indicates perhaps just how much power China can wield. And indeed, I would go further and say that the whole of this readout in many ways is indicative, I think, of Ukraine really trying to please China, perhaps to be expected given what's going on at the moment and the vital role that China plays in terms of providing support for Russia. And of course, there was all that anxiety that China might be preparing to give more weapons to Russia. So it's understandable in that context. But there are some this morning who are anxious about this, who are sort of almost crying a sense of betrayal, saying that Ukraine are treating Taiwan's territorial integrity as suspect, just as other countries did and do to them with regard to Crimea and the Donbass. And if so, as Sophia says, it would speak, I think, to the challenging position that Ukraine finds itself and the desperate need it feels that it has to keep China on side. But as I say, I think it is important to register there is some alarm bells ringing this morning amongst certain quarters. But as I say, it's perhaps understandable in the context of the importance of China. And who knows, perhaps a prerequisite for this call was a commitment from Ukraine that they would reaffirm this view of the One China policy. But in other news, just another couple of updates I thought it was important to go through. Our Rome correspondent, Nick Squires, reports that an Italian journalist has been wounded and his Ukrainian colleague killed in an apparent sniper attack by Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. Corrado Zunigo, a correspondent for La Repubblica newspaper, was working with Bogdan Bitik when they were ambushed by suspected Russian snipers in the eastern Kherson region. The journalists were attacked near the bridge which crosses the Dnipro River near the city of Kherson. And reading a quote here from the surviving journalist, "I heard the shots. I felt a burning sensation in my shoulder and I saw my colleague fall to the ground just 1 meter from me. He died in front of my eyes, an atrocious act. He was a great friend and a wonderful journalist. We've been working together for months. In all 5 assignments I've done in Ukraine, I had him by my side. He leaves behind a wife and son." And Ukraine's foreign minister has told Italian media that the Russians were responsible for the killings. Russians don't care if you're Russian, Italian or Ukrainian, they just shoot, he said. Now, that hasn't been independently verified, but it is strongly believed that this was Russian soldiers. And finally, an interesting story on the ongoing ammunition saga. So we've talked a lot in the past, of course, about how Ukrainian soldiers are not able to fire as much ammunition as they were in several months ago due to this so-called ammunition crisis. Indeed, I saw a piece on the BBC this morning out of Bakhmut where soldiers were describing that they haven't got enough ammunition for their weapons. This is clearly still a problem. But what's interesting is that the UK and Germany are said to be working together on developing advanced tank ammunition. So they've said that they're going to produce high-tech armour-piercing tank rounds for future Challenger 3 and Leopard 2 tanks. Ben Wallace, Defence Secretary here in the UK, has said we're very pleased to work with Germany on this programme, helping equip equip our respective armed forces with a crucial battle-winning capability. The standardised ammunition will not only benefit battlefield collaboration with many of our NATO allies, but has important export potential for UK and German defence industry partners. Now, interesting to hear Dom's reflection on that in a moment, but just before I turn to Dom, I think it's quite interesting seeing Jens Stoltenberg talking about how Ukraine has received about 1,550 armoured vehicles and 250 tanks in the context of this. Clearly, they are trying to emphasise, I think, that how much has gone to Ukraine. But I wanted to ask you, Dom, before we bring in our guest, what's your assessment of where we are in terms of donations to Ukraine compared to what they were promised in terms of tanks? Listeners will, of course, recall all of those tallies of things that were going through to Ukraine and what were promised. But what's your assessment of where we actually are in terms of things on the ground and ready to be used in the counteroffensive?
Well, I would say Ukraine, the view would be that they've sensibly, I think, gone rather quiet on this. So we've tried to keep up to date with who's been pledging what and who's promising what and who's been delivering what. But it does get very confusing because there's so many different natures of equipment and ammunition now. So I think the closest we can get to is the comments by Jens Stoltenberg that he said more than 98% of the combat vehicles promised to Ukraine are now there. So depending where you draw the line and do the maths, we're probably not going to get the actual answer, but we've all heard of a lot of armoured vehicles being promised over the last few months. So if the vast majority of them are there, then that's got to be, that is a good thing. Now, he also says that in total we have trained and equipped more than 9 new Ukrainian armoured brigades. So I mean that is a big old thing. So 9 brigades, depending how you squeeze it, you could probably make 3 divisions out of that. Very roughly 3 brigades make up a division, 3 divisions a corps, and so on and so forth, an army and so on. You draw the organogram from that. But I don't think they'd do that. I think what they probably have is 2 properly heavy metal brigades with a nice healthy reserve there. So let's say 2 brigades, even if you have 2 brigades each of 3, 2 divisions each of 3 brigades, and then you keep 3 divisions up your sleeve to re-roll as necessary when you actually start getting into the close combat. So I think we're more likely to see 2 than 3 divisions. And also, of course, that it's not just a question of having all the bits and pieces on the ground. It's the controlling them and organising them that is arguably, well, as we've said before, the great quote, amateurs do tactics, professionals talk logistics. I mean, it's all about sustaining it, getting through the immediate fight and fighting tomorrow as well. So I think what we'd have here, the Ukrainian armed forces to suddenly be able to take on all these new brigades, if they wanted to try and wield 3 divisions, which I'm suggesting they might not, that would just be too much of a command and control nightmare. Think about the staffs for each of those, and then the commanding and coordinating authority above that. I just don't know if they'd be able to take that. It'd be too indigestible a lump of heavy metal. So I think, so Mark Carlton-Smith, who was the former the chief of the general staff, the head of the British Army here before Patrick Sanders, I worked for him a little while ago, and he used to say that the very first thing the commander has to do is sort out the command and control, work out who's in charge of what, who's responsible for what, who talks to whom, who's responsible and who liaises, etc., etc. Get all the organisation sorted, and then everything else will fall from that. But if you don't get that bit right, if you have an absolute bugger's muddle of an organogram of lines going everywhere and who's responsible for this and so on, it will just all fall apart. So I think what Ukraine might be doing here, or might be trying to do, is to keep it simple. KISS, as we used to say in the British Army, KISS, keep it simple, stupid. Don't overcomplicate things, and ensure you've got a nice fat reserve there for when trouble comes down the line. And just on that point about the tank rounds, I'm been looking into this because it's only broken in the last hour or so, and we need to get Hamish DBG back on to talk these things. These new rounds that Britain and Germany are developing for tanks, they're calling them enhanced kinetic energy rounds, EKE for short, which eek, I'm sure that's the noise that they'll be making on the other side of the range when these things start coming towards them. I mean, these are, I've got to look into them because I thought Challenger 3 and the next generation Leopard 2, I thought we were going to try and transition to smoothbore. We've got rifled barrels at the moment in Challenger, which is fairly niche. Most other main armies these days have smoothbore barrels, so you can put other natures of ammunition down them rather than rifled barrels. So I'll have to see what these things are and whether it's a new gun that's going on Charlie 3. But yeah, just so people are aware, there's basically two types of tank ammunition. There's kinetic energy and then there's high explosive. So high explosive, which we call HESH, high explosive squash head, because the head of the round physically squashes against the side of the thing you're directing at, normally soft-skinned vehicles or bunkers. That squashes a big patty of high explosive, or rather makes the bang from the high explosive behind it has a much greater effect. That doesn't really get through the frontal armour of a tank. That's where you need the other round, the kinetic energy round. There is no explosive in a kinetic energy round. They're about 12 inches long, a couple of inches wide. They are just a depleted uranium dart, but they're going so fast, they're in what's called the hydrodynamic regime. They go faster than 1,500 meters a second, and at that speed, metal kind of acts like liquid. That's what they say, and the metal just bores through the tank. So there's no explosion from when you hit a tank with a kinetic energy round. You just see a small flash of the metal on metal, but they're designed to perforate rather than just penetrate, so to go through and out the other side. And not only does that create a god-awful mess on the inside, it kills everybody, but also the sudden increase in pressure with the blast wave behind that thing increases the temperature and just will set off any charges that's left. So kinetic energy is is a very quick but very nasty way to go. But I'll need to have a look into these, and we should get old Hamish back in to talk exactly what they are, because I think it does mark a big shift in the certainly the British philosophy about designing our tanks.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. I'm trying to get my head around all of these different military terminology. So we're very pleased to have with us Peter Dickinson of the Atlantic Council, a leading American think tank in the field of international affairs, headquartered in Washington, D.C. Peter Dickinson is the editor of the Ukraine Alert blog at the Eurasia Centre and the publisher of Business Ukraine and Lviv Today magazines. Thank you very much for joining us, Peter. First off, what can you tell us about your background and your work on the issue of Ukraine?
Hi, Francis. Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to join. I'm a big fan of the podcast, so it's really great to come on and speak to you directly. I'm British originally. I've been in Ukraine since I graduated from university in the late 1990s. I originally came out here. I was appointed on a one-year contract with the British Council on a kind of civil society engagement role. That expanded into a little bit longer, and when that contract came to an end and it was time to come back to London to continue with the British Council, I decided to stay for a little bit longer, and then 1 year became 2, became 5 years, and here I am 25 years on, still here. So I think there's quite a lot of the expat community, if you talk to people in Kiev and across Ukraine who are similar to me, who came here fairly randomly and fell in love with the country and became fascinated by Ukraine and found themselves setting up their lives here. My work these days is focused on the Atlantic Council, where I manage their Ukraine coverage. I also have 2 English language publications that I own and publish in Lviv and in Kiev. But neither of them are publishing at the moment because of the war, of course. So we basically put them on hold and just operating online. And I'm focusing on my role at the Atlantic Council and covering, providing as much coverage as I can, and working with a lot of the stakeholders here and internationally to provide as much coverage as possible of the war and of the bigger issues behind it.
Well, thank you very much. And now I quoted an article from you recently where you made the interesting observation at the lack of reaction by Russia to Finland joining NATO. You wrote, Russia's apparent lack of concern over Finland's NATO ascension raises obvious questions about the validity of Putin's efforts to portray the invasion of Ukraine as a reasonable response to creeping NATO enlargement. If Putin genuinely felt NATO posed a security threat to Russia, he could have attempted to derail Finland's membership bid via a combination of diplomatic and military pressure. First of all, I just wanted to ask you, what do you think Putin could have done if he was really serious about this sort of idea of NATO enlargement with regard to Finland? What specific steps do you think he could have taken?
Well, I would have expected to see certainly a lot more bluster, certainly a military build-up along the Finnish border, perhaps in the Baltic Sea, a lot more of the kind of threatening behaviours that we've seen from Russia elsewhere, not only in Ukraine but elsewhere, in terms of the Russian Air Force buzzing around, entering airspace, threats at the diplomatic level, cyber attacks perhaps, attempts to mobilise or destabilise Finnish society. So we've seen over the past 9 years of Russian aggression against Ukraine a wide range of hybrid hostilities, the capacities that Russia has, above and beyond or alongside rather conventional military capabilities. And we didn't really see any of that towards Finland. We saw a very almost resigned or impassive response where they didn't actually take any concerted action. And in fact, the reports that we have, the information that's available, suggests that they actually withdrew the vast majority of the troops that they've had stationed along the border area for many, many years. So they actually pulled back on their defences, which I think speaks volumes about how they really genuinely see NATO.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was just a very interesting observation that I hadn't seen anywhere else, and I think it's a really important one, as you say, for disassembling Putin's arguments and justifications for this war. Another interesting thing that you said in the article, and again I'm quoting from you here, you say security guarantees that come with NATO membership are probably the only reason why we are not currently confronted by an even larger war and further Russian invasions. Unless Ukraine can secure similar security guarantees, a lasting peace in Eastern Europe will likely remain elusive. How likely do you think it is that the West will be willing to offer Ukraine such security guarantees?
Well, I think this is, at the moment, that's probably the big elephant in the room. It's apparent, certainly the view from Ukraine is that must happen, that they must have security guarantees. I think a consensus is building. We've seen in the recent weeks the Estonian Prime Minister Kallas was in Kiev saying very much that they need Ukraine in the EU and NATO, and they must end these grey zones, European security grey zones, which Ukraine, of course, is the great grey zone. We also had an article appearing a few days ago in Foreign Affairs from the Prime Ministers of Poland, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, again saying Ukraine must have security guarantees before NATO membership, almost, not immediately, but certainly by the war's end. Otherwise, we will not be able to have a resolution. Then you have other figures, such as even Henry Kissinger has changed his tune significantly over the last year to basically now recognise that, yes, Ukraine's place should be in NATO. So there's a growing consensus, I think, that Ukraine should be part of the Western security club. But there's huge problems about the idea of NATO membership. I think it's very difficult to imagine any scenario where all 31 members are unanimously in agreement about allowing Ukraine to join, simply because it would put them in such direct and immediate confrontation with Russia. There's going to be huge reticence there, huge reluctance to enter into that. So then the question becomes, well, what can be offered instead in place of NATO membership? Is there anything that could offer NATO standard security guarantees? Frankly, I've not seen anything that's really convinced me that's possible, that some form of non-NATO security guarantee, maybe some form of coalition involving the United States, Britain, certainly the Baltic states, Poland, perhaps the countries of Central Europe, maybe also France and Germany or other willing partners, could come in and offer security guarantees. I've not seen anything really concrete in that direction. But I think we're going to have to talk about that. That's going to be a big conversation for the next few months, and certainly if we see progress towards a potential end to the conflict. I think we'll know a lot more after the summit, the coming NATO summit in July in Vilnius. That's going to be a very important event, and that's going to be the top of the agenda, one would hope. If it's not, then we've got a problem. But again, at this point, I don't see exactly what the security guarantees will look like, but I think it's clear that they have to be put in place. Otherwise, there'll be no peace. Otherwise, we'll just have a pause.
And as you say, the nature of that peace is fundamental, because if, for example, I'm sure the Ukrainians would argue that if Crimea if they were forced to concede that, not that I think that they would actually accept being forced to concede it, if you see what I mean. But let's say they were, hypothetically, then there'll be many countries, I'm sure, in Europe who might be one of these security guarantees who would feel very uncomfortable about offering that, because they'd fear that, Russia still have an influence on Ukrainian territory, and the likelihood of it flaring up into another war that you'd then be obligated to go and fight in would be on the rise. But it was, in contrast, if this was a total victory for Ukraine as they've defined it, then I think it would be much, much easier for, say, Britain, America, other NATO countries to say, yes, we are more than willing to give these security guarantees to Ukraine. I mean, do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, so much depends on the battlefield here. I mean, so much will be decided by the events that are going to unfold, presumably in the coming weeks and months with Ukraine's offensive. If in a best case scenario, if Ukraine were able to achieve its goals of full liberation of the country's territory and a convincing victory, and presumably that would also lead to considerable weakening of the Putin regime, maybe even major destabilization within Russia itself, a window of opportunity would open up, perhaps almost comparable to 1991 or the 1990s, when the West was able to welcome in new members to NATO, was able to enlarge and welcome these new countries in at a time when Russia was not in a position to oppose. That may be the case again, but I think that's a best case scenario. The issue of Crimea, as you mentioned, is key again. And I think any Russian presence on Ukrainian territory will be a massive red light for countries who are being asked to secure Ukraine's security, and you secure Ukraine's basically sovereignty. Obviously, if they're saying, well, the country is not fully sovereign, how can we secure it? We're basically essentially going into a direct confrontation with Russia that will escalate. And Russia, I think, has been very clear. I don't think there's any illusions now in the West or internationally in general that Russia does not accept to live alongside an independent and democratic Ukraine, does not accept Ukraine choosing its own path, does not accept Ukraine controlling all of its territory even. So the scope for further war is huge, and unless there are serious guarantees put in place to prevent further war, it does have an air of inevitability about it.
Now, you mentioned Henry Kissinger a moment ago, and I was interested in your reflections on his position because, of course, as you say, his has shifted over the course of the war. But one of his central principles, which I don't think really has, is that he argued pretty early on that once it was clear Putin was not going to take the whole of Ukraine, that actually Ukraine had already won this war, that victory had in a sense been achieved, and that, yes, they would probably lose some territory, but compared to where they were and in terms of the now historical reality that Ukraine will become more part of the West as a result of this terrible invasion, that in a sense his argument was that the West should really be saying that this is a victory for the West and consolidate its gains, bring the rest of Ukraine into the country and try and end the war as soon as possible. I just wanted to hear your reflections on that assessment. Do you think we are being too pessimistic and too absolutist about what a victory looks like for Ukraine?
I mean, I think from an abstract point of view, you can look at it, and I think certainly from some perspectives in the West, where Ukraine is still seen as quite a new concept, and there's a degree of flexibility about it and what Ukraine constitutes. There is an inclination to sort of say, oh, come on, let's do a deal on this. You can lose this region or that region, and you will be better off in general. Your future will be bright, but I don't see that from the Ukrainian point of view. I mean, from the Kiev perspective, on the contrary, there's a very clear view that they have to keep the country together, that if they were to lose one region or two regions, Crimea, the Donbass regions of Donetsk and Lugansk, any of these territories, if they were to concede anything, it would be the beginning of the end. It would not stop there. It would go on. It would legitimize Russia's aggression, and it would encourage further aggression. So there's a sense that it's really an all or nothing. They can't allow Russia to continue doing this. This invasion of the last 14 months has been an incredibly traumatic experience for Ukrainians, but they also had 8 years before that of a much lower grade war, which was also claiming lives and causing stress and disrupting everyday life. And then before that, we can go back hundreds of years of Russian interventions and Russian involvement, Russian imperialism in Ukraine. And there's a sense now, which I hear very, very frequently around Kiev, that like enough is enough. And this is the moment. If we don't break free now, if we don't put an end to this now, it will never end. And also a sense, well, we have an opportunity to do it now because we see that Russia is weak and we are far, far stronger than we thought we would be. This is what I see from many Ukrainians. And I think there is a sense that they have to push it now. They cannot compromise.
And that certainly tallies with the Ukrainians that we've spoken to on this podcast many times. And I do think, as I've highlighted before on the podcast, that this is one of the biggest gulfs between some Western understanding, or should I say, because of course now Ukraine would probably see itself as part of the West, but what I mean is certain diplomats, say in France and Germany and other countries, that believe that a war that can be summarised in the way that you just have, that there are things that can be conceded, whereas the Ukrainians, are absolutely adamant that it has to be now or never. And until that gulf is filled, there is going to be misunderstandings, fundamental misunderstandings between both sides, which could be very dangerous in the longer term picture. I mean, I could even foresee a situation where, let's say, certain Western countries felt they could no longer provide the military support because they didn't agree with the idea of Ukraine trying to take Crimea, for instance, that you'd see Ukraine try and take Crimea perhaps without some of that Western military support, which could be a very precarious diplomatic and military situation indeed. So I think this is a really important point that you've just made there. I wanted to go back in time though a bit, if I may, which is that in 1997 you served as the British Council's information manager in Western Ukraine. You facilitated dialogue between Ukrainian NGOs and academic sectors and also promoted UK government outreach in the region. Ukraine has obviously changed a lot since then. What are the biggest changes that you've observed in the country?
Well, I think without a doubt, it's national identity, it's nation building. The progress that Ukraine has made is night and day. When I first arrived, the sense of Ukrainian national identity was there, it existed, but it was far, far weaker. There were far, far more people who were not hostile to Ukraine, but indifferent. They did not necessarily associate with the Ukrainian state. And it's important to remember and to underline, in fact, that Ukraine had undergone decades and decades of Russification, often quite brutal, and it was and huge amounts of suppression of Ukrainian history. People didn't know basic things about their own history. It was often quite remarkable that I would get into conversations with people and realize they really didn't have a clue about some pretty fundamental things. I remember one occasion in Lviv in the early days, they erected a statue to King Danilo. He's a king of the Kiev Rus era, the early medieval period, who was a very important person in the history of the city of Lviv and of the wider region of Western Ukraine and Ukrainian history. And most people I knew had no idea who he was. They'd never even heard of him because, of course, in Soviet times, that was not something that was taught. And that, there are many, many examples like that of people really having little idea. But over the years, there were certain key moments. The Orange Revolution in 2004 was a huge, huge watershed in Ukrainian modern history. It was a real moment where the country did diverge from this sort of general post-Soviet path where Ukrainians identified themselves very clearly, certainly after the Orange Revolution, I think, as Europeans, as a democratic country, however flawed they may have been, and also as a country with a civil society where people could take their fate into their own hands, whereas in most of the other former Soviet countries, and especially Russia itself, the opposite was true. They were turning back towards authoritarianism. So that was a key moment. Then the Euromaidan revolution 10 years later. And I think most of all, of course, is Russian aggression. The 2014 seizure of Crimea, again, was just an incredibly shocking experience for all of Ukrainians. The war in East Ukraine that began in spring of 2014, when basically Ukraine didn't have an army, essentially. And millions of Ukrainians at that point were faced with a very simple question. Are you really Ukrainian? Do you really feel Ukrainian? Would you fight for this country? And they made the choice that, yes, they would. Thousands, tens of thousands volunteered and basically went to the front with whatever they could find. So they were volunteer battalions sprung up all over the place, very ragtag formations of people just dressed up in their hunting kit, with hunting rifles, with sports shoes, with whatever they could sort of piece together on the way. And they succeeded in stalling the Russian invasion in the east. Then we had the not frozen, but simmering, let's say, conflict for around 8 years. And of course, now we have the last 14 months of the full-scale invasion. But throughout this period, this growth in Ukrainian national identity has been really profound. And I think that's the key story of this war that we're having now. People talk about NATO, they talk about the West, they talk about Russia, they talk about Putin's ambitions, but all of it is a reaction, certainly from the Russian side, is a reaction to what's been happening in Ukraine. The idea that Putin has this sense that he's losing Ukraine, that it's slipping away from him. And if he loses Ukraine, there is a great chance that he will then suffer further losses, and Russia itself could begin to unravel, because Ukraine plays such an important part in Russia's own sense of self, of national identity. So this is a war of independence for Ukraine, and it's a war of national coming of age, so to speak. And it's part of a much longer process that I think is not always understood by international audiences, that is really shaped all that we're seeing now in the country and in many ways defined it.
Thank you. I know Dominic Nichols has some questions. Dom.
Thanks, Francis. Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us today. If I could just stick on that last point you were making there, this sort of war on culture, if I could paraphrase it, and just ask you how planned do you think this was? So at the moment we're seeing these attacks, or President Zelensky said there's an orchestrated attack on museums and culture, and the orchestrated movement of personnel, Ukrainians out of the country and Russians in. And I just wondered what your views were on how systemic and organised that is. Is it an actual war on culture? And also, did Putin see this coming? Did he see this rise in Ukrainian nationalism coming and feel that he had to act sooner rather than later? Or has he blundered into this and almost caused the very thing that could be his downfall?
Well, that's a very good point. I think to a significant degree, he has caused it. He is the architect of his own worst nightmare. He has been behind a lot of the moments that I mentioned. The Orange Revolution was largely possible in 2004 because Putin came blundering down to Kiev, went on all the national TV channels simultaneously, lectured Ukrainians for hours about who they should vote for in the coming presidential election. And people who were very apolitical, I remember that period very well, people who were very disinterested in politics, very cynical, for the first time in my experience of knowing them, and from some of them I'd known for years, for the first time ever, they were very, very annoyed and angry and mobilized. And all of a sudden they wanted to do something. They wanted to get engaged because they were so offended by Putin's intervention. So he has a habit of doing this. And of course, the wars themselves are the ultimate example of that, the siege of Crimea and the full-scale invasion we see now. So yes, Putin is to a significant degree has caused these problems that he complains about. I think he's very much aware of it, yes. I mean, I think he sensed that Ukraine was slipping away. He sensed that Ukraine was in danger of becoming a success story, becoming an integration success story, and becoming a much stronger nation with a much stronger sense of national identity. And that identity, crucially, was as a democratic European country. Now, because Russia and Ukraine are, I think, objectively so close in many respects, culturally, certainly ethnically, historically, the fear in Russia is, well, if Ukraine can make that transition to European democracy, then Russians will want the same for themselves. I think that's a very realistic fear. I think if Ukraine is successful in this war, we will live to see that. So that was part of Putin's fear. I think he was very conscious of it. And he was conscious that the clock was ticking because these processes have been ongoing for some time, and Russia's responses have become more and more aggressive over the years, from interference, from corruption to limited military interference to the full-scale invasion. So we see them getting more and more violent in their responses as the clock ticks and time runs out. Now, the first question you ask in terms of how systematic are these attempts to suppress Ukrainian identity, suppress Ukrainian culture, I would say very systematic. I think this is at the core of what Russia is trying to do. I would advise any readers or anyone who wants to really understand what Russia is doing in Ukraine to read Putin's essay from July 2021, when he basically laid out a blueprint for the suppression and the extinguishing, essentially, of Ukraine's national, certainly statehood, and one could argue national identity, essentially arguing that there is no Ukraine without Russia, that Ukraine can only exist with Russia, that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, which essentially means that Ukrainians are a type of Russian. It certainly doesn't mean that Russians are Ukrainian, and so forth. So he speaks about these things quite openly. And if you watch Russian TV, which of course is very closely and carefully choreographed, the genocidal language that you hear is routine now. They've normalized genocide. They openly say that there is no Ukraine. There must be no Ukraine. Ukraine is an invention. It's an anti-Russian invention. It must be crushed. And again, if you hear the accounts of the survivors from areas that have been occupied, again and again, you hear the same stories of them attacking people who have any symbols of Ukrainian identity, any tattoos, for example, people who have a record of being pro-Ukrainian, people who have it on their telephones, maybe a Ukrainian flag or some sort of photograph of something that could be interpreted as pro-Ukrainian. That is a signal to attack. So they are clearly targeting Ukrainian national identity in a very systematic, methodical manner. I don't think it's by accident at all. I mean, perhaps some of the bombings of individual libraries might not have been particularly planned, but overall, there's clearly a plan in place, and the plan is genocidal.
Thanks. And if I could broaden out just a little bit and talk about security in the round, I'd just like your view on whether the word guarantee is still helpful. I'm thinking of Obama's red lines in Syria that Bashar Assad trampled all over and then nothing happened. And I just wonder if ambiguity is better here. I think Ireland is outside NATO, but if Ireland were invaded tomorrow, I think they could probably expect some friends to turn up. And we started off today talking about Ukraine's very careful language with Xi Jinping over one China, which is the grandest of all international fudges that recognises China but acknowledges Taiwan, or whatever the wording is. But it's a fantastic fudge. And successive US presidents are always asked, would you go to war over Taiwan? Because there is ambiguity there. So I just wonder if security guarantees it sort of spooks the horses too much. You say to an ally, are you going to offer a guarantee to Ukraine? Yes or no? Come on, what's it going to be? And it almost puts the onus on us, and I feel it's no longer a helpful term. Just wondered what your view was on that.
No, I think you make some good points there. I mean, there's certainly an argument that it's not helpful, and Ukrainians are very skeptical, to say the least. Of course, Ukraine has the very painful experience of the Budapest Memorandum, which they believed were security guarantees, and then it was actually pointed out to them in 2014, when it actually mattered, that actually all they've been offered was security assurances and not guarantees. They're very painfully aware of reading the small print of international agreements that they put their name to. Perhaps it makes sense to word it differently and to frame it differently. And I think fundamentally the only real guarantee is a strong Ukrainian military. So whatever the international support that we see, the international framework, I mean, Ukrainians will tell you very often, like, there is nothing else but NATO. It's only NATO. It must be NATO. That's a good argument, but I don't know how realistic it is. Personally, I think that it is not very realistic in the short to medium term. So I think we are left trying to, sort of scrambling to find some sort of formula that would work, that would be sufficient to deter Russia. But even with NATO membership, again, Ukrainians are very aware that they have to have a very strong military themselves, and they have to have it built up extensively to the degree where it becomes simply unadvisable for the Russians to attempt to even think about launching further attacks. But as I mentioned earlier, I really do struggle to see a genuinely plausible and convincing alternative to NATO membership in terms of something that would deter Russia.
Sure. Yeah, I think yes, I agree. So just finally, just still on this framing idea, I just again would seek your views on the narrative around and the importance of the expected Ukrainian counteroffensive that's being billed as sort of all or nothing, and war is very rarely like that. And I'm concerned that there are so many different ideas on what success will look like, and would a shortfall, would a significant thrust, but that didn't make the coast or didn't clear the whole lines, is that good enough, or anything short of an overall Ukrainian victory from this counteroffensive? Is that going to cause a rush for the exit, or rush for negotiations? I just again seek your views on how it's being framed, and if it's being carefully handled or handled with sufficient care that people understand that it could still be a successful offensive and the war could carry on for months or years to come? I mean, do you see it being framed as an all or nothing effort?
Well, I think that yes, to a significant degree, yes, I see that quite a lot, and I think Ukraine has been part of that, but I think also international coverage has also contributed to that, and it's understandable in a sense. I mean, we saw such success from Ukraine in the autumn of last year, the Kharkiv offensive in September, then the liberation of Kherson in November, and there was real euphoria and a sense of momentum, and then that kind of dissipated, and then all of a sudden the talk has been. The spring offensive. It's coming. We see all the weapons coming in. We see the tanks coming in. The agreements on the large numbers of armored vehicles, etc. And so this has been building up for 5 months now. It's almost half a year, and there is huge expectation. Now, if that expectation if we do have an anticlimax, as you say, if they don't advance, or if they suffer very heavy losses, or if they make a minor advance, take a few small towns here and there, but don't have any decisive breakthroughs, then I think it will create issues. It will certainly fuel the conversation that we're already having and already hearing about maybe it's time for a negotiated settlement of some kind. Certainly that's being pushed by the Chinese, by Brazil, by a lot of the global south, by obviously Russia itself. That could be the case, but I don't think we'd be in a scenario where Ukraine would be abandoned, where people where the West would say, you know what, we gave it our best shot and it didn't work out, so it's time to call it a day. I think we're a long way away from that at this stage. But it would be challenging, certainly. It would be challenging to maintain the kind of momentum we've seen and to convince the Western partners that they should be giving more and more. A successful general gets whatever he wants, but an unsuccessful general tends to have to try and justify themselves. So it'll be very challenging if they don't make the progress they are hoping to make, and I think that a lot of people now expect them to make. So perhaps we have built it up too much, which is dangerous. But let's see. Maybe they'll do. They surprised us last autumn. Nobody was anticipating the kind of success we saw then. So maybe they'll do it again.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for your really interesting reflections today. Are there any other thoughts that are on your mind, on your radar, that might not be on ours?
Well, I think we've had a great discussion. Thanks very much for hosting me. It's been a pleasure. No, as always, my thoughts are with the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian soldiers, the men and women in Bakhmut today. I'm in Kiev, and we do sense the war here. It's inspiring and also horrifying to think about what they're going through. So, I would always wish to just remember them and give thanks to them and the sacrifices they're making.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. We'll come back to your final thoughts in a moment. I just wanted to, I know it's not usual for the host to have a final thought, but I hope listeners will permit me to have one today, as I wanted to recommend a fascinating long read, which you might want to read and cogitate upon over the weekend. It's by Verstka, Verstka. It's an independent Russian media organisation. It's hard to find, and it's only in Russian, but one can read it by Googling Verstka and clicking on the first link. Then if you scroll down, you'll see an image of Putin with some planes behind him. That's the article, which you can read by putting it through Google Translate. It's a bit of a faff, I know, but for me, it's one of the most revelatory long reads I've read since the war began, up there with the Washington Post revelations regarding the intelligence assessments prior to the war. It's called How Putin Came to Hate Ukraine, an investigation into how the Russian president came up with the idea of a war with Ukraine. And it's based on conversations with former and current officials in the Russian and Ukrainian authorities. Each of them apparently occupies a certain place either in the political establishment in Russia or in Ukraine. So these are supposedly, allegedly from very high up figures. Some of its top lines: Putin's motives for starting the war were personal resentment and a desire for revenge, the last straw being the closure of the media assets of his godfather Viktor Medvedchuk, of course someone we've spoken about in the past. He decided, it says, to attack Kyiv in March 2021, and the preparations for the invasion went on for almost a year. But almost all of this time, the Kremlin proceeded from the wrong assumptions and calculations. Now, I can't summarise all of the of the nuances of this piece, but it goes back to 2012 and it looks at some of the speeches from that time when it seems that Putin's stance on Ukraine began to change. It argues that part of the reason for that is some of the philosophers and authors at the time that he was reading, and it seemed to be that he was digesting some of these. There were certain special groups set up to be thinking about Ukraine, and a lot of these readers and authors didn't recognise Ukraine as an independent state, and certain quotes had clearly suggested an imperial mindset with regard to Ukraine. And so one thing that this piece does is really try and dissect a timeline as to these perceptions with regard to Ukraine. Another interesting insight, if true, is that the piece argues the story of the separation of Donbass was not Putin's personal initiative, but the initiative of FSB officers. So you'd had the success of Crimea, and the feeling was amongst the SMB is that you could have a similar situation in the Donbass, and several key players told Putin, let's go in, there are pro-Russian forces in there, we can organise a counter-campaign, we shouldn't abandon people, it will be another triumph like Ukraine. And obviously that isn't exactly what happened, but nonetheless it speaks to the fact that there were certain fundamental misassumptions, and that this was not just coming from Putin but from other elements within the Russian state. Another insight, Putin continued to aggressively find links between Ukraine and the United States. He was apparently certain that NATO and the US controlled Ukraine. He found it very hard to conceive that it was actually democratically led, and he said that he was convinced that the US embassy in Ukraine employed more than 1,000 people, something that just isn't factually accurate. I think the embassy in Kyiv has about 180 American citizens and about 500 Ukrainians working at the embassy. But even so, he believed that America essentially was controlling this and was manipulating the country. Apparently, during his first telephone conversation with Zelensky, Putin was convinced that he would be very malleable. He was fairly respectful, but very quickly he turned against him when Zelensky went for Medvedchuk and his television channels, which Putin took as a personal attack, according to this piece. And it seemed at that moment, according to Putin and according to this article, that the bridge between finding a sort of peaceful resolution, as in Russia having significant influence over the country, was severed. And it was at that point that he began to conduct things in a much more of a military fashion in terms of seizing potentially the whole country. It also talks about Medvedchuk's mentality and conversations with Putin that were had. And according to one official it cites, he told fairy tales, mastering his money and saying that he paid for organising political resistance and did not believe that anyone would ever check. He talked about the loyalty of Ukraine and the territory, stupidly misleading Putin. And it goes on talking about the preparations, as I say, lots of detail on that. Then it talks about the original drafts of the article that Peter spoke about earlier on the historical unity of the Russians and Ukrainians. Apparently, originally, in the original draft of that, something now that I think will go down in infamy, particularly the way in which it was ignored by many commentators in the West as being something that he couldn't actually genuinely mean. Apparently, in the original draft, there was actually going to be a military threat in there, but it was removed at the last minute of the final version. So again, speaks to just quite how far forward in the imperial mindset Russia actually was prior to the start of the war, perhaps far more so than people appreciated at the time. It seems that Putin really did believe it was possible to change the regime in Kyiv quickly and painlessly, and there were many advisors that were telling him just that. And so the elite mentality was sceptical, and according to the piece remains deeply sceptical, but there's a mentality that essentially they have to work together as a team, and that if you don't, that you'll be threatened, and it gives examples of where that's happened as well. So sorry, I know going on a bit there. It's a long piece. I think it's probably about 20,000 words, but hopefully interesting, and one that I think will be used as a key source for when asking some of these questions. But Dom, I've gone on long enough. What are your final thoughts?
Thanks, Francis. I'm well. In answer to that, there were many who saw the threat very clear-eyed many years ago, thinking Dragon Bear here as we're talking about that. But my final thoughts: the old chef and my would-be lunch partner Yevgeny Prigozhin has been up to his tricks. So he's in. I don't know if he's in Bakhmut, but he said that the Wagner force there has laid off the artillery strikes in Bakhmut to allow visiting US journalists to be hosted by the Ukrainian military to make a film. So, hey, is this the shell shortage we've heard about? Is it Prigozhin up to his tricks. I mean, it probably is the shell shortage. He just likes to be front and centre of these things. I can't imagine out of his magnanimity he's allowed this press tour to go ahead. And maybe I'm a conspiracy theory too far, but I just note in the last hour, Moscow has said it's denied a request by the US Embassy to visit Evan Gershkovich, the journalist who's being held in Moscow. Gershkovich, sorry. And I just wonder if the two things are connected, because Moscow is saying they're not allowing this consul visit because the US turned down a load of visas for Russian journalists to accompany Sergei Lavrov to the UN earlier this week. Yeah, maybe it's all, like I say, I'm reading too much into it, but I note I think it's actually illegal to deny consul access to someone in who's been detained. But that shouldn't surprise any of us, and neither should it surprise us that Prigozhin's up to his tricks. But yeah, I will continue to watch both of those.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. Peter, would you like the very final thoughts today?
Well, my final thoughts, I suppose, should probably be looking ahead to the Ukrainian coming offensive. It's certainly going to be a key moment in the war. The question is when it's going to happen. People have been speaking about the spring offensive for some months now, and recently I've started hearing people mention the summer offensive, which gives a good idea of where we're at now. So it's not clear when it's going to come, but it's going to come soon-ish. And I think there is a key thing to watch will be the Russian morale, how the Russian troops hold up. I think we've seen in recent months the mobilized Russians that have been brought to the front lines in large numbers were able to sort of solidify the lines after Ukraine's advances last autumn. But there have also been indications of crumbling morale, of demoralization. A lot of addresses posted online complaining about high casualties, cannon fodder tactics. So the hope in Ukraine, certainly, I think something to watch for would be potentially a 1917 moment, or a put le caput, as it were, moment where large numbers of Russians simply stop fighting. And given the control Russia has on the domestic front, it probably looks like the weakest link in the Putin regime at the moment may well be his army in Ukraine. So as the Ukrainian offensive takes shape in the weeks ahead, that's going to be something to watch.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Rachel Duffy.